People change their behavior the moment they know they're being watched. Every manager assumes this. Most managers can even name the study that proves it. Except the famous story behind that study is not quite what it seems, and almost nobody teaching it has gone back to check. In the 1920s and 30s, researchers studied worker productivity at Western Electric's Hawthorne plant near Chicago. They ran a series of experiments, adjusting factors like lighting and break schedules, watching what happened to output on the factory floor. For decades, the story told about these experiments was simple, clean, and endlessly repeatable in a lecture hall. Dim the lights, output went up. Brighten the lights, output went up again. The conclusion practically wrote itself. It wasn't the lighting that mattered. It was the fact that workers knew they were being observed. Mere attention, the story goes, was enough to change performance, regardless of which direction the actual working conditions moved. That tidy version made it into nearly every management textbook written since. It became one of those ideas so widely repeated that nobody thought to question where it actually came from. Generations of managers have used the Hawthorne effect as shorthand for people perform better when they know someone's watching, and left it there, as though the light bulb story was settled science. Here's the part nobody expects. When economists went back decades later and actually reran the numbers on the original raw data, the lighting productivity link mostly fell apart. Output changes tracked things like the day of the week and ordinary learning curve effects far better than they tracked the lighting changes themselves. Workers got faster over time simply because they were doing the same task repeatedly, the way anyone gets faster at a task they repeat. Output dipped and rose with the calendar, the way productivity does in almost any workplace. Monday slower, midweek faster, and so on. The famous observation alone boosts performance story had been oversimplified from research that never actually produced a clean version of that pattern in the first place. That's a strange thing to sit with. An idea repeated in business schools for 100 years, used to justify everything from surprise inspections to performance reviews, turns out to rest on a shakier foundation than anyone let on. It's not that the Hawthorne studies were fake, or that nothing interesting happened at that plant. It's that the specific, dramatic, lighting flips a switch version of the story was never really supported by the data underneath it. Somewhere between the original researchers and the textbook writers, the messy, ambiguous reality got smoothed into a clean parable, because clean parables are what get repeated. So what does actually hold up? What the studies support, more modestly, is this. When workers get pulled into something novel, when their normal routine changes, and when they get noticeably more attention from managers or researchers than usual, performance sometimes shifts. Not because of one dramatic lighting reveal, but because novelty and attention and a changed routine all matter on their own terms. That's a smaller, less cinematic claim than the textbook version, but it's the one the evidence can actually carry. It helps to understand why novelty and attention do this in the first place. Part of it is straightforwardly about visibility. Work that's being measured tends to get more careful effort than work that quietly disappears into a spreadsheet nobody checks. Part of it is about the disruption of routine itself. Any change to a stable process, a new schedule, a new supervisor walking the floor, a new metric suddenly tracked out loud, tends to produce a short-term bump in performance, almost regardless of whether the change itself is an improvement, simply because people are paying more attention to what they're doing. That's closer to a novelty effect than to anything mystical about being observed. The learning curve piece deserves its own explanation too, because it's the least dramatic part of the story and probably the most important. Anytime a person repeats a task, they get incrementally faster and make fewer errors, purely from repetition, independent of lighting, supervision, or anything else happening around them. Early attempts at a new task are slow because people are still working out the fastest sequence of motions, still hesitating over edge cases, still checking their own work more than they'll need to later. A few weeks in, that same task gets done faster, simply because the unnecessary hesitation has been trained out. If you run an experiment that lasts several weeks and doesn't control for this, you'll see output climb steadily no matter what you do to the lighting, because you're mostly watching people get better at a task through sheer repetition, not watching them react to being observed. That's a big part of what the later reanalysis found. A lot of the productivity kept rising pattern was just this ordinary curve, dressed up as a dramatic response to observation, because the observation happened to be running at the same time. There's also a subtler distortion worth naming. The incentive researchers and textbook authors have to prefer a dramatic story over a boring one. A tidy narrative, dim the lights and people work harder purely because they're being watched, is far easier to teach, cite, and repeat in a lecture than a messier one involving weekday patterns and gradual skill acquisition. That's not a conspiracy, it's just how ideas get flattened as they pass from original data to journal summary to textbook paragraph to a manager's one-line memory of a business school lecture from a decade ago. Each retelling trims the caveats, because caveats don't fit in a slide. It's worth remembering that the next time any classic study gets cited with total confidence and no footnote, there's a useful comparison here to a few other well-known patterns in psychology and management. The placebo effect works on a similar logic in medicine. People who believe they're receiving a real treatment often show real physiological improvement, even when the treatment is inert, because expectation itself changes outcomes. The Pygmalion effect, also called the Rosenthal effect, describes something related in a different direction. When a manager or teacher expects more from someone and treats them accordingly, that person often performs better, not because expectations are magic, but because expectations quietly change how much attention, coaching, and opportunity the person actually receives. None of these effects say that belief alone rewrites reality. They all point to the same underlying mechanism. Attention, expectation, and changed treatment produce changed behavior. And it's easy to misdescribe that mechanism as something more mysterious than it is. Physics has its own version of this idea, the observer effect, where the act of measuring a system can disturb the very thing being measured. Managers borrow that language loosely, just observing them changes them. And it sounds satisfyingly scientific, but the workplace version is a much more mundane, social phenomenon than anything happening at the level of particles. People aren't being disturbed by measurement in some deep physical sense. They're responding, consciously or not, to the fact that someone with authority over their job is now paying closer attention, and that changes incentives, not physics. It's worth separating the borrowed metaphor from the actual mechanism, because the metaphor makes the effect sound inevitable and mysterious, when it's really just ordinary social incentive response, the same thing that makes a driver slow down the instant they spot a patrol car, whether or not the officer was ever planning to pull anyone over. There's a related trap worth naming too, the halo effect, where one positive impression, a strong first quarter, a confident presentation, a well-liked personality, colors how a manager reads every subsequent data point from that person. Combine a halo effect with a Hawthorne-style novelty bump, and a manager can walk away from a new monitoring rollout convinced the intervention worked, when what they actually watched was a temporary spike, plus their own generous interpretation of an employee they already liked. Untangling the two takes deliberately looking at the numbers after the glow fades, not during the honeymoon period. Picture a generic version of this playing out in an ordinary workplace. Not a specific documented case, just an illustrative scenario. A regional sales team gets told a new dashboard will track call volume starting Monday. Nobody changes their compensation, their territory, or their script. Call volume still jumps for the first 2 weeks. Is that because tracking calls magically motivates people? More likely, it's some mix of novelty, of people wanting to look good on a new number leadership can now see, and of a temporary jump in self-monitoring that fades once the dashboard becomes routine furniture nobody glances at anymore. That fade-out matters as much as the initial jump. It's a strong hint that what's driving the bump is newness and visibility, not some permanent shift in how hard people are willing to work. Now imagine a second illustrative scenario, this time about quality rather than speed. A customer service team is told that a sample of calls will be reviewed each week by a manager, with feedback given individually. Handle time barely changes, but complaint rates on reviewed agents drop noticeably, for a while. Then imagine the reviews get less frequent, quietly, without anyone announcing it. 6 months later, complaint rates on those same agents tend to drift back up. That pattern, a real behavior change tied to real, ongoing attention, rather than to a single dramatic reveal, matches the modern, more careful reading of the Hawthorne research far better than the light bulb story ever did. A third illustrative scenario, this time closer to how a lot of teams actually work now. Imagine a remote team that switches to activity tracking software, the kind that logs keystrokes or takes periodic screenshots. In the first week, measured active time jumps noticeably across almost the whole team. Nobody got faster at their actual job overnight. What changed is that people stopped stepping away from their desks as often because they know something is now watching for idle time. A few months in, once the tool becomes background noise nobody thinks about, active time numbers tend to drift back toward wherever they started, while some employees quietly find workarounds, moving a mouse periodically, keeping a tab open, that satisfy the metric without reflecting real engagement with the work. That's the Hawthorne effect, and it's fade-out playing out in modern software. And it's also a warning about what happens when a metric becomes the target instead of a proxy for the thing you actually care about. This is also where the modern evidence actually gets more interesting than the myth it replaced, not less. Employees who know a manager is actively reviewing their numbers still tend to perform differently than when they believe no one is checking, and that pattern shows up across a wide range of settings, from sales to manufacturing to customer service. Hospital hand-washing compliance is one of the most striking, well-documented examples. Compliance rates have repeatedly been shown to rise sharply during periods when staff know they're part of an observed study and drop again once the observation period ends. That's not folklore, and it's not a light bulb parable. It's a consistently replicated pattern in a high-stakes setting where the stakes for getting it wrong are measured in infections, not quarterly numbers. Here's the part that cuts the other way, and it's worth sitting with as its own twist. The debunking of the light bulb story doesn't mean the underlying idea was wrong. It means the idea was right for a more boring, more mechanistic reason than the version everyone was taught. That's actually the more useful lesson for a manager to walk away with. The Hawthorne effect isn't a magic trick where watching people transforms them. It's a predictable, structural pattern. Visibility plus novelty plus attention changes short-term behavior, and that effect fades once the novelty wears off and the attention becomes routine and unremarkable again. For managers, that has a very direct, practical implication. If you want a durable improvement in how a team performs, a one-time spot check, a single dramatic announcement that, starting today, we're tracking this, or a surprise inspection will get you a short-term bump that looks like real progress, and probably isn't. The bump comes from novelty, and novelty by definition doesn't last. What actually produces a lasting shift is deliberate, regular attention tied to real, ongoing feedback, not a one-off reveal. Weekly, not one time. Specific, not vague. Tied to actual coaching and consequences, not just a dashboard nobody explains the meaning of. That also means you should be skeptical of your own numbers whenever they're gathered, only during a period when people know they're being watched. A quarter where performance suddenly looks great right after you announce new monitoring isn't necessarily proof the monitoring worked. It might just be the Hawthorne bump, temporary, novelty-driven, and likely to fade the moment attention moves elsewhere. The honest test of whether a change actually worked is what happens after the novelty wears off, not during the first few weeks when everyone knows they're being graded. Concretely, that means building at least one deliberate follow-up check into any new process, 30, 60, 90 days out, specifically to see whether the initial bump survived or quietly evaporated. If a metric that spiked right after rollout has flattened back to baseline 3 months later, that's not a failure of the team. It's exactly what the research predicts. And it's a signal to redesign the intervention around sustained attention rather than a one-time announcement. Treat the first month numbers as noise until they've survived contact with boredom. It's also worth thinking about which kind of attention you're actually paying, because not all attention produces the same effect. Attention that's purely evaluative, a number on a dashboard someone glances at without ever discussing it with the person behind it, tends to fade fast, because it doesn't carry any real information back to the employee about what to do differently. Attention that's coached, a short, regular conversation where someone explains what the number means and what a better version of next week looks like, tends to hold up much longer because it's not just observation, it's feedback the person can actually act on. That distinction, watching versus coaching, is arguably the real lesson buried under 100 years of lightbulb folklore. My own take, having sat through more than one rollout built on exactly this kind of thinking, most organizations chase the dramatic reveal because it's satisfying to announce and easy to point to as a management win, and they underinvest in the unglamorous, repeated attention that actually sustains behavior change. The lightbulb story is popular precisely because it's a single clean moment. The real mechanism is a habit, and habits are much less exciting to put in a slide deck. So here's the concrete takeaway to actually apply. Stop treating a single announcement, inspection, or new dashboard as the intervention itself. Treat it as day one of an ongoing rhythm. Build in short, recurring check-ins, weekly or bi-weekly, where you actually look at the numbers with the person and give specific feedback, not just a glance at a screen. Rotate what gets closely reviewed so attention itself doesn't go stale and become the new invisible furniture. And when you evaluate whether some new process actually worked, look at the data from after the initial observation period, once the novelty has worn off, not just the flattering first few weeks. There's a rotation piece worth spelling out further. If the same 3 metrics get reviewed every single week forever, employees adapt to exactly those 3 metrics, and everything not being watched quietly slides, which is its own version of the fading Hawthorne bump, just redirected at whatever isn't currently under a spotlight. Periodically shifting which part of the work gets closer attention, this month it's response time, next month it's a different quality measure, keeps the underlying mechanism, novelty plus visibility, working in your favor instead of letting people learn exactly where the blind spots are and drift toward them. That's not about catching people doing something wrong. It's about recognizing that attention is a limited resource that decays in effectiveness the longer it sits in the same place, and managing it accordingly, the same way you'd manage any other resource that loses potency through overuse. None of this requires more monitoring software or bigger dashboards. If anything, it argues for less dashboard watching and more actual conversation, since a 5-minute conversation that explains a number and asks what's getting in the way tends to outperform a permanent, silent tracking tool that nobody ever discusses out loud. Don't rely on the lightbulb version of this story anymore. The real research is messier and, honestly, more useful because it tells you exactly what to do instead of just telling you that watching people works. Follow for the psychology behind how teams actually work.